All right, so let's talk about France now. On the map, we see that France is represented in that green, minty green color. And they have colonized a very different part of the continent than the Spanish did. So take a second on the little map in the corner of your notes, and your notes look like this. On the second page, it should say France at the top. You're going to shade the part of the map where you see France colonizing the Americas. Big swath of the middle of the continent, way up into what is modern day Canada and the Canadian province of Quebec, or Quebec. All the way down here, this is a really important river that we know cuts through the middle of the modern day United States and the continent. It's the Mississippi River. And it goes all the way down, flows into the Gulf of Mexico. And the big city we may know, the modern city we may know, that was originally claimed by France and then kind of went into the Spanish hands for a while, and then back to France, and then into the United States, that's New Orleans. There's a reason why New Orleans is a city with a lot of interesting architectural, food, language, people, diversity. All right. So France gets into this colonization game after Spain does, and it starts really more in the 1500s or the 16th century. And they start and they colonize a very different part of the continent. So they are not encountering as much of the different kinds of indigenous people, basically. The French are, and that's going to be important. These are some dates that are important to know. I'm not going to quiz you on knowing these dates, but just as a history student, I want you to know that in the middle of the 18th century, France loses Quebec. And then in the 19th century, under Napoleon, they lose the Louisiana Territory. And Louisiana Territory is not just modern day, the state of Louisiana. It's this big, huge section in the middle of the continent that France claims as a colony. Okay. So the French motivation, and now again, you're going to be in this box right here. I'm going to take a sip of water. You are taking a couple notes here for France. France's motivation, specifically in the Americas, was to compete with Spain for the glory, for the power. In Europe, there was a big rivalry between the courts of France and Spain. And they, again, were all cousins, but they were competing with each other for control. Maybe you can hear my puppy barking. They also wanted and they hoped that they could find a water route that cut through the continent from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific. Now take a look at the map. Does any such river exist that flows all the way through the continent? I don't see one. So that was a wash. Now, this one is really important. Now, before I read this to you, I want you to look at this guy, what he's wearing. This is the Sun King, Louis XIV of France. There were a lot of Louis in the history of France, which you'll learn more about in 9th grade. Louis XIV, he was decadent, opulent. He had a ton of money. He built the Palace of Versailles, which maybe you've heard of or been to, or one day we'll go and see. It is massive. It's massive, huge. It's covered in gold, all of these mirrors everywhere. Like, he was just really showing people how much wealth he had as the French king. And during his reign, they really discover, rich Europeans discover how warm, how luxurious, how they thought it was exotic to have animal skins and furs that came from animals that you could only find in North America. So look at what he's wearing. He's wearing a lot of animal skin. He's wearing animal furs. I mean, it's hard to see, but he's really covered in them. And in this portrait, he's showing us as the viewer, I have all of this money that I can send explorers across an ocean, send them for 3 months on a really dangerous trip across an ocean to go and procure or get these animal skins and bring them back to me in France. And he's showing that to us in that portrait. So the French discovered how valuable those animal pelts were. And a pelt is just another name for like a skin. And the French were specifically interested in the beaver pelts that could be found mostly up here and near the Great Lakes region. And so they would capture them. They would trade with indigenous groups who were already knew easily how to capture and skin beavers. And they would sell them and trade them back in Europe. And they wanted to make money. So that's what they did. That was a really huge, big motivation for the French. And this takes time and effort. It's not like the same as growing cash crops. It takes time. Now, there was some effort to convert indigenous native peoples to Catholicism because the French, like the Spanish, are also Roman Catholic. They also are a Roman Catholic court. The king is Catholic. He makes sure everyone else is Catholic. It's a big problem if you're not Catholic in France at the time. So they also use some of that motivation to recruit investors back in Europe. We're going to go and save the souls, is what they might have said, of the native indigenous people in the Americas, and we will convert them to the Catholicism. So there was some effort to do that as well. In what region did this happen? It's really the region here. It's a lot of it happens above us, north of us, in what is modern day Canada. And France claims, under the control of an explorer named Cartier, claims this area in modern day Canada as New France. And they set up trading posts along the St. Lawrence River near Quebec and Montreal, modern day Montreal or Montreal. And then later on, down here in the Louisiana Territory, the French sort of take people and sail down the Mississippi River, and that's when they established a colony, a pretty thriving trading port in New Orleans. Okay, so one thing I really want you to know is that the French treated indigenous native peoples very differently than the Spanish did. Now, that's a big simplification, because were there French explorers, colonizers who treated the indigenous horribly with violence? Yes, of course there were. Were there Spanish explorers who had great relationships with indigenous people and traded humanely? Yes, they did. But this is what we as historians kind of categorize the differences between those European colonizers. The French were much more interested in being a business partner, having business partner relationships with native peoples. This is one I do want you to write down. So under the section that says treatment of native peoples here, please make sure that you write down that it was more of a business partner relationship, a working trading relationship. They were willing to trade more often. It wasn't always a zero-sum game for native people like, okay, well, if I teach these French explorers these skills that they might need, I'm going to get something in return that can help my life, like guns or other resources. But that's not to say that the native people, indigenous native people who worked with France, weren't immune from dying from those diseases that Europeans brought in the Columbian Exchange. And then later on, the French they have an ally. They have indigenous allies, and they use their allies to fight against their long-standing rival, the British, with the British indigenous ally, and that becomes really, really volatile in the Americas. So what's the legacy really fast? So the French, because they settle, most of them settle in northern Canada. Think about the weather in Canada and the climate in Canada. It's really harsh. And unless you have the resources you need to survive winters there, it can be really hard to get things going and to establish thriving communities. So in a lot of ways, the French don't have a really strong hold in the Americas because of how harsh that climate was. But they do establish smaller colonies and smaller ports, trading ports. And the French language is still spoken throughout the Canadian province of Quebec. And it's spoken throughout much of Canada. So if you're in 8th grade in Canada, it's likely that you're probably going to be taking French in school, because signs in Canada are also listed in both French and English. And that's a legacy of French colonization. Canada also, there's a lot of Catholicism in Canada, especially in Quebec and Montreal. And in Louisiana, interestingly, we talk about like Creole culture in Louisiana. There is like I said, big diversity of people in Louisiana, especially near New Orleans. And Catholicism is also really, really big in Louisiana as well. And that's a legacy of French influence and really Napoleon's influence too in establishing that. And these are just some influential explorers. And honestly, guys, I'm not going to read those to you. So you're welcome to write down a couple. Losing my voice. Excuse me. And lastly, I just wanted to show you, these are a couple pictures of me and my sister. And this was in 2017. And we went to visit Montreal. I'd never been there before. It's so cool. I loved it. But this was November. Do you see how cold it was? It was freezing. It was freezing. It was freezing, snowing the whole time. And the architecture in Montreal, because the city is so old on the continent compared to cities we have in the United States, that you can see really, really old buildings. And the downtown in Montreal kind of looks like Europe too. So just wanted to show you those pictures. That's my sister, my older sister. All right, we're going to stop there. But before I go, I do want to show you that on my daily agenda slide, on the second slide, you can join my GimKit class. If you are already done with your Pocahontas primary source, you can join your GimKit class. So if I'm in 5th period, I'm going to click this link. I'm going to join the class. And then once I'm in the class, then you can click here for the Fishtopia assignment that can help you review for the Open Note quiz. Thanks for your patience, guys. I really appreciate it. I know it's been a long week of listening to these videos, and I am anxious to get back. See you soon.